We're going to start off by sharpening an image. We're going to do output sharpening to begin with, and then we'll go to creative sharpening. So output sharpening is what we do at the end of the workflow. So you've created all of your layers, you've worked on your file, you've made your art. You want to do a save as from that file. That will be your master file. You always want to save the file with all of your layers. That will be your master file. The save as is what we're going to sharpen because we're going to flatten the layers. You want to flatten it, and then we're going to size it, and size it being sizing the file. So you're going to have different amounts of sharpening for a larger file than you would for a smaller file. You may need more sharpening for matte paper than you would for gloss paper. So you may need to do some tests along the way, and you'd size it to whatever size you're going for and then do the sharpening and make a little test print. Now, as I say little test print, and you're thinking 20 by 30 isn't little, take a section of it and print it out on your 8.5 by 11 inch paper and see how the sharpening is looking. Okay, so let's get started here. First thing we want to do is duplicate the background. So I'm going to do Command J. Let's name that sharpen. Remember, it's always a good idea to name your layers. Now, right now, I'm viewing this at 44.6%. I can't see anything at 44.6%, so let's upsize this to 100% so I can see what I'm doing. Next up, I'm going to go to Filter, and I'm going to come down to Sharpen, and I'm going to go to Unsharp Mask. Notice there's a variety of other sharpen options in here, but we are going to be using Unsharp Mask. What Unsharp Mask is, it's an old school analog technique where you duplicate a negative and have it be slightly out of focus, and then you'd sandwich it together with your sharpened or your sharp negative, and it would increase the contrast around the edges, creating an illusion of greater sharpness. So that's what the Unsharp Mask, where the name comes from. So how cool is that? Now let's look at this little dialog box. It has an amount, a radius, and a threshold. Let me tell you what they do. The amount is when you sharpen an image, Photoshop takes the edge between two colors and makes the lighter pixels lighter and the darker pixels darker. The amount determines how light the lighter pixels get and how dark the darker pixels get. If you set the amount too high, the picture will look grainy and overly contrasty. You'll actually lose detail. Now the radius determines the area that will be sharpened. A lower radius means only the pixels right next to the edge will be sharpened, and a higher radius means a wider area will be sharpening. Setting the radius too high can give you some weird, funky halos around your edges, so be careful with that. The threshold determines how much contrast there needs to be between the colors for them to be sharpened. A higher threshold means higher contrast areas will be sharpened, but low contrast areas will not. Sharpening low contrast areas makes them look rough and speckly. So setting the threshold too low will give you a grainy look on low contrast images, and it'll make the noise stand out, so stay away from that. Now let's see how we do this. One of the things I want to do is I want to come up here and I want to be able to see the sharpening taking effect here, so I'll click on that, and notice it pops up over here in my little window. I can move it around by just grabbing it here. And then I can come back down here, so I can be looking at two different areas while I'm sharpening. So, play with the amount, see what it does. Crank it up. Ooh, yucky. Play with the radius, see what it does. Crank it up. Oh, look at that contrast. I'm even losing detail up here. Contrasted, the color has changed because of pushing that radius too high. Well, while it's up here, let's play with the threshold. And then pulling the threshold up kind of softens everything back down and gives us that info. So let's take that back down. How I work this is I like to many times think in a diagonal here. So I'm going to play with a relationship between my amount, a radius, and threshold as a diagonal. So the radius would be about halfway between the threshold and the amount. And I said about. You don't have to be exact. Okay, so as I start to crank this up and crank this up a little bit more, I'm looking for sharpening. Remember, you are sharpening. You want to see the sharpening take effect. What's the point of sharpening if you can't see it? But you don't want it to be too much. And it's looking like it's getting to be a little bit too much. I don't like how things are starting to get a little bit too crispy in there. So I'm going to pull this down a little bit, and I'll pull this down a little bit. And I'm turning on and off this preview button right here. That's looking a little better. If I come over here, I can click on and off of this image as well, the little window, to see the amount of sharpening.
Well, guess what, gang? I think that's looking pretty good. I can hit OK. If I get done with it and I think that I've done too much sharpening, I can always go to that sharpening layer and reduce the opacity a little bit. So play around, explore, play with those numbers. Sharpen it a couple of different ways. Try the Kelby numbers at the bottom of the handout.
The last thing you need to do is save it. So Shift Command S, and we're going to title it Unsharp. Unsharp. You want to save it as a PSD file, and we're going to save it to a folder called Sharpening. Remember, a PSD and a TIFF will save the layers. And there we go.